The EU is saying to the Sri Lankan government, we don't approve of some of your policies. Policies that have nothing to do with economics in terms of internal politics. And because of that, we want to change your behavior, and so we're threatening you with some very, very serious trade sanctions that we intend to make you rethink what you're doing domestically. The EU doesn't know what the impact will be, hopes the impact will be felt by the Sri Lankan government and not by the Sri Lankan people, but that of course is all to be decided. The significance of the threat from the EU is very sizable. It really is the equivalent to putting a gun to the head of the Sri Lankan economy, arguably to the head of the Sri Lankan voter with the upcoming presidential elections in that country. It's focused on the garment industry, which is key to the Sri Lankan economy, and to have an impact, it really has to bite in Sri Lanka and really has to be felt, ironically, by ordinary people. The effects are going to be very, very serious. You're talking about an industry in terms of the garment trade that is 30% of the exports go to the EU, so the EU really has some influence there. 1.2 million people are employed in Sri Lanka, directly or indirectly, by the garment industry. It's several $1 billion in terms of revenue. So the foreign exchange earnings and the employment is key to the success of the Sri Lankan economy, which is finally recovering now after all of the terrorist problems. And what I expect, sadly, is that that industry is going to take a really serious, tangible hit, and it's going to be felt by the people who are employed in it. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through the whole host of reasons because sadly there are so many, but I think the one that's had the least coverage so far, but is arguably the most important, is the fact that the ordinary Sri Lankan, particularly the person who's usually female and young working in that garment industry, is either going to see their quality of life reduced significantly or is going to lose their job. I mean, the young lady who's making that lingerie that's going to be bought by a female customer in the United Kingdom, she may not have a high income by our standards, but it's a real life for her at home, one that gives her and her family some hope for the future. The EU is threatening to take that away, and that's why I think that it's fair to describe this threat as economic terrorism, because it's ordinary, often very poor, usually female Sri Lankans who are really going to feel the butt of the EU sort of economic rifle. Unfortunately, there are always unintended consequences from trade sanctions. Often they're quite perverse. I think what's at stake here, and it's as much a moral question as an economic question, is that the very people who are going to suffer the worst are those who have no say in the policies that are instituted in Sri Lanka, particularly the non-economic ones that the EU is so concerned about. So we are attempting to change the behavior of the political elite, but in practice we're going to do it by threatening or arguably actually hurting, injuring those Sri Lankans who are the majority, who have absolutely no political power and bear no responsibility for anything that may have gone on in that country. Yes, the garment industry is key to the success of the Sri Lankan economy. Over the last quarter century, it's been growing at a rate of something like 20% a year. About a third of all exports go to the EU, and this is the hold that the EU feels it has over Sri Lanka, that if they tighten the noose around those garment imports coming into Europe, that they can have a real effect on Sri Lankan government policy. Well, the Sri Lankan government is going to react, I think, the way that most sovereign governments would, including those that make up the EU, and that is to be extremely concerned that a foreign multinational body is attempting to meddle in their domestic affairs, which is what the EU is attempting to do. In practical terms, this means the Sri Lankans are going to withdraw in terms of their relations with Western countries, particularly within the EU, and they're going to be drawn to other countries such as Iran and China, who are very keen to extend their influence in South Asia. But obviously, this does not further the goals of European foreign policy to have greater influence for the Chinese and the Iranians in a part of the world where we already are anxious and insecure about the future dynamics. Unfortunately, trade sanctions against Sri Lanka are as unlikely to work as they have been historically just about everywhere they've been tried. There's been a lot of research done on this. One famous study, looked at every trade sanction implemented between 1914 and 1990. That's 115 cases, and found that in 2/3 of those cases they just completely failed. Other researchers looked at those alleged successes and found that, in actual fact, nearly all of those alleged successes were actually failures. So the bottom line is, you're looking at probably less than 5% of the time that countries introduce trade sanctions do they have their intended effect. And there's absolutely no reason to think that the EU will be any more successful bringing in trade sanctions against Sri Lanka. I think it's a tremendously sad day if these sanctions actually go into effect. There's no economic foundation for this. There isn't a moral foundation for this. We're going to hurt the people that we allegedly are trying to help. And what are we doing this for? All to achieve a very dubious goal of interfering in the internal affairs of a foreign country.